I was talking about the fact that I used to do photography. And when you do photography, at least when I did it, when I first started doing photography, I would sit and decide to go out for a shoot. I would shoot everything I thought was interesting, and it was easy, and I got good shots. I was happy with the fact that I could do that and that I could kind of stumble upon something that was interesting. Well, I decided I wanted to get better. So in the process of getting better, I decided I'd take a class. I started taking classes at Santa Monica College and began to learn visual communication, the whole idea of being able to communicate a scene and the meaning behind what you see, visual literacy. And that changed the way I shot. In fact, at one point, I couldn't shoot anymore. I can remember coming out of a class one night after having gone over a review, or a critique actually, of my slides as well as the slides of some of the other students in my class, and thinking, oh God, I lost it. I can't shoot it anymore. And literally bursting into tears. I just barely made it back to my car before I just burst into tears, because I felt like I couldn't shoot anymore, because I was trying too hard. I was trying to think of all the rules and all the things that I needed to do to make a good composition, a well-composed photo. And I got so frustrated that I really didn't want to shoot anymore. For a while, I put the camera down, but then I had to pick it back up because I had to finish the class. So I picked it back up, and I said, forget it, I'm just going to shoot. And I shot. And when I shot, and I began to review my photos, I found that I was using all the rules, that in order for me to use them well, I had to forget them. Because if I didn't forget them, the desire to keep them would keep me from being able to shoot and to do well. The rules are there for a reason. They're there to give you structure. They're there to give you a framework within which to work. They're there to give you a fence almost, or a periphery. And they're there to say, if you go beyond this point, you better have a good reason. Not that you can't go, because most of those rules can be broken intentionally. But you have to have the intention to break them. You have to know what you're doing so that if you break them, it makes sense visually, and the viewer can understand it. Well, that was a lesson that I had to learn. I had to forget the rules in order to be able to work. The other one was when I first started painting. I had a professor at AIU who would kind of hover, which really annoys me. I hate when people look over my shoulder. It makes me very paranoid and nervous. But he would kind of hover, and then he would give what he called suggestions, but for me they felt like nagging. It was just nagging. And I didn't want to hear it. And after a while, I even told him, I said, well, whose painting is this, yours or mine? Because you could do stain, you could do this, you could do that. Well, obviously that's not what I wanted to do. I'd have done it. So, in frustration one day, I took my easel, I took my canvas, I took all my paints and brushes, I took a chair, and I left his class during his class. When it was time for us to sit there and paint, I said, bye. I need to not have your input. And I found a spot in the parking lot, in the outdoor parking structure, that had a nice breeze, and it was quiet, and it was peaceful, and I could look out over the city, and I set up my easel, and I began to paint. And then I had another moment where I felt like I've lost it. Because once I got out of the classroom, I still couldn't get his criticisms out of my ear. And I was trying to follow the rules. I was like, that's a mistake. I needed to turn him off in my head. Otherwise, it would not have been my painting. It would have been his, or what he thought my painting should have been. And I had to work through that, and I got very frustrated, and I burst into tears again, because it's like, I suck at this. I totally suck at this. And then eventually I had a good cry, and eventually I went back to the class, or I went back and sat down like the second or third day after doing what I thought I needed to do over, and then not doing that, and then putting heavy medium over that, and then putting other heavy medium or spackling over that, or putting some sort of texture coating over that to try and smooth it out. It was more of a spackling. Troweling it on, trying to erase my brush strokes. And I couldn't erase my brush strokes because you can't erase paint. All you can do is paint over it, and it builds up, and it provides texture, and it begins to give depth. Well, by the time I got to the place where I could actually add color, nothing was flat anymore. It was all had texture. There were trowel marks and brush marks, and there were lines from underneath where I had made brush strokes, and there were lines underneath from where I had made shapes and forms, and they all began to come out. And so when I put the paint on, the paint was no longer flat. It didn't just lie there flat anymore. And at first, it was annoying because I hadn't seen or I hadn't foreseen how something not flat could look put together or well composed. But as I began to paint with the color this time, and as I began to create other forms on top of that, and do washes, and do trowel marks on top of that, I could see that the lack of flatness was a good thing. That every mistake I had made in the beginning, I could still see the evidence of having made it, but it made the overall painting, the end result, so much more rich and so much more full-bodied, and gave it so much more depth that the mistakes were just as important, if not more important, than my initial intention. Because all of my mistakes before helped to form that final product. And had I not made those mistakes, there's no way I would have been able to have a pleasing outcome in the end, or as pleasing an outcome in the end. And for me, as I sat today thinking about that and working through that, I came to the conclusion that that is most definitely a metaphor for life. Our mistakes are just as important as our intentions. Because when I began to make those paintings, or that particular painting, I had no idea what I wanted my end outcome to be, that final product. I was just working through the paint. And that sometimes is just really nerve-wracking. I don't paint much today for that reason, and I need to fix that. But it's one of the reasons I don't paint much, because it's hard. The process for me emotionally is hard. It's hard for me to let go of all the processes and the rules in my head and just be free and just flow and just let whatever is in me flow out, unedited. Okay to make the mistake. You know you can't erase the paint, but that's all right. You don't need to, because it's okay, because something good will come of it. And I'm beginning to learn that that's how I'm having to live my life. Not that I set out to make mistakes. I don't think anyone does that. And I certainly don't set myself up to make mistakes. However, you have to have the freedom to know that if you do make a mistake, it's okay. Get the lesson. Learn from it. heal from it, and move on. And for me, the only way to do that is through Christ. He is the one who takes all of that stuff, the intention, the accident, the injury, all of that stuff, and makes it make sense and gives you an outcome that was better than your start.